Hello everyone and welcome to our Cargill Confectionery Series. My name is Coco Joe, and in this video we'll talk about chocolate molding. We'll cover your chocolate molds and how to do successful solid molding as well as hollow shell molding. Let's start with the molds themselves. Today's modern molds are made of polycarbonate, which has a beautiful gloss. There are different grades of plastic and polycarbonate used for molds. The ones we're showing here are very glossy, shiny polycarbonate. And chocolate will always mirror the surface that it touches. So as long as your molds are glossy, your finished chocolates will have that same gloss. Now, after molding your chocolate will shrink as it solidifies. That contraction or shrinkage is what allows it to release from the mold. We don't have to spray any type of a mold release into the mold. So perfectly tempered chocolate is important so you get that great contraction. The care for your molds is very important. If you ask the mold manufacturers how to care for your molds and how often you should wash them, they'll usually tell you wash them as infrequently as possible. If you're using well-tempered chocolate and you're molding with the same chocolate in your mold, you should be able to reuse that mold over and over again, since you're getting good contraction and you're not leaving any film of chocolate in the mold. When it does come time to wash your molds, you'll want to do it with a very mild detergent such as Dawn, and don't use very hot water. 140-degree water or cooler is suggested, and be very gentle when you're cleaning out the molds. Do not use any kind of an abrasive surface. Use a very soft cloth for washing. And once they're washed, you'll want to dry them. I use this really soft cloth, shaking out the mold after it's been washed, and I usually go through and I dry off each cavity. If you've got air to blow, that's another great way to make sure your molds are dry so you avoid water spots. Let's start with solid molding, and it could be a solid bar or any other shaped piece. It's as simple as filling the mold with chocolate and then shaking or vibrating the mold to get a nice level chocolate and also eliminate any air bubbles. Vibration is the best way to get rid of air bubbles, and you can either shake the piece on the table like this or use the assistance of a shaker or a vibrator. This one I actually built myself using a Syntron jogger, which I think is for paper, and I just attached a tray to the top of it. But there are many manufacturers that'll make a shaker table that can be used for this. So let me demonstrate making the bar. The best way to eliminate the air bubbles is to actually fill the mold while it's shaking on your shaker table. So I'll demonstrate that first. You can see the air bubbles already starting to come up, but if you don't have a shaker table, that works just fine too. So a mold like this, which is actually a very thick mold, could be filled only part way if you have a certain weight of a bar you'd like, or you could overfill the mold slightly and use a scraper to level it off, and that way you would be certain to get the same weight with each mold. Now, cooling is very important with chocolate. The cooling temperatures that chocolate works best in are 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And the amount of time that it'll take to cool will depend on the amount of chocolate that needs to be cooled. So I have approximately 3 to 4 ounces of chocolate in this mold, which is a fair amount of chocolate and probably takes 20 to 30 minutes in a 55-degree cooling tunnel to solidify. A very thin molded piece will take a shorter amount of time. The mold does act to insulate the chocolate, especially on the bottom and the sides. So that's why air movement in your cooling cabinet or your cooling tunnel or even your refrigerator will really help the cooling process when you're cooling your solid molds. Next, we'll demonstrate hollow shell molding. The steps are to completely flood your mold with chocolate and level it, shake out any air bubbles, and then you'll pour the chocolate out of the mold to create your hollow shells. So let me demonstrate that for you, and we'll start with mold temperature. Previously we mentioned that room temperature is fine, but if you have a mold like this with a lot of detail, you might want to have your mold a little bit warmer to be sure you can shake out all those air bubbles. The infrared thermometer is a great way to measure your surface mold temperature, which is 70 degrees, which will be fine for this very smooth dome mold. It helps to level out the mold before you shake off air bubbles. And I usually do half at a time to try to minimize the mess. Now, the longer you wait to pour out the mold, the thicker your shells will be. But I think this one's ready to pour out. And when you scrape the excess chocolate off the mold, keep it flipped over. That way you won't be pushing the chocolate back into the mold. Once you've given it a good scrape, you could take a look at your shells and decide if they're the right thickness. I didn't quite take enough chocolate out. They're a little thick for me, so I'll continue this. So to solidify the shells, a 55 to 65 degree cooling cabinet is perfect, and since it's a thin layer of chocolate, they should solidify pretty quickly, 5 to 10 minutes. I've always been asked what's the best orientation for cooling. You can lay it flat on a piece of parchment, or you can stand it up like this in your cooling cabinet, or you could lay it down like this. Either way. I typically stand them up just to avoid having the chocolate not flow back into the bottom of the mold. I will talk about viscosity when we discussed the video on viscosity, and we mentioned that a thinner chocolate is best for this hollow shell molding. So usually a viscosity around 27 Brookfield is a great viscosity for doing the shell molding. I'll show you another tip for pouring your mold out. When I demonstrate it onto the parchment paper, that's one way that it can be done. But if you have a large enough tempering machine where you're getting your tempered chocolate, you could just pour the mold back into your tempering machine. Another option would be to find a container that fits your mold, such as this, and you can lay the mold full of chocolate on top of the container and tap or shake it, or use your vibrator to evacuate the mold, such as this. That way you don't need to tap or shake. The vibration of the shaker table will evacuate the chocolate out of the mold for you, and then you simply have to scrape the rest into the container. There are many ways to decorate your shell molded chocolates, and I'll make a couple of suggestions. You can use colored cocoa butter or colored chocolate and paint it into the mold to highlight some of the decorations. You can also airbrush that colored cocoa butter into the mold, and there's just an unlimited number of designs that you can use to end up with beautiful chocolates. You can even splatter with a brush or string into the mold before you do your shell molding. Another suggestion is to use transfer sheets. These are sheets of acetate that have beautiful designs, silk screen onto one side, and this image will transfer onto your chocolates. You can get a specially designed mold which has a removable back and it accepts the transfer sheet very easily. The transfer sheet can be cut to the right size of the mold, and be sure that your image side is touching the chocolate. So that would be down in this mold. Replace the back, and this mold is ready to be molded with your shell mold. Once that chocolate crystallizes and contacts the colored cocoa butter, that image will transfer off of the acetate and onto your chocolates. And when you demold your chocolates, you'll have that beautiful design and it will have beautiful gloss on the top of the mold. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out more videos in our Cargill Confectionery Series. I'm Coco Joe. Have a sweet day.